Look, Nigel Farage is remarkable because whether you're in favour of Brexit or not, I think you can't deny it's probably the most consequential foreign policy decision we've taken since 1945. The further they shift to reform, the more they will continue to lose votes to the Liberal Democrats. President Clinton, but he's the great communicator, but he has nothing to communicate. Enoch Powell once said, a politician who complains about the media is like a sailor complaining about the sea.
Welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. My name's Tom Clougherty. I'm the Executive Director here at the IEA. And it's my great pleasure this evening to be in conversation with Sir Vernon Bogdanor. Vernon is a Professor of Government at King's College London. He's one of the foremost experts on the British Constitution. He's the author of numerous books, the most recent of which, Making the Weather, 6 Politicians Who Changed Modern Britain, is the subject of our discussion tonight. Vernon, welcome to the IEA.
Well, thank you, and thank you for saying I was an expert on the Constitution. It's perhaps not too difficult to be one when we don't have a Constitution. But there are 2 reasons why I'm particularly grateful to you for inviting me. It's very propitious. And the first, which I'm sure you had in mind, if you saw the archive section of the Times today, it's the anniversary of the defeat of Ramsay MacDonald's first Labour government by the Conservatives, who had a large majority. And 50 years ago, at around this time, Keith Joseph began, who's one of the people in the book, began his series of speeches giving evidence of a rethinking of traditional conservative principles in favour, broadly speaking, of the market economy. And obviously the Conservatives now do need a similar period of rethinking, having lost the election. But the second reason why I'm grateful to you for inviting me is that it's rather charitable towards, I suppose I might call myself a sinner who's been converted, because I used to go some years ago to meetings of the IEA, and I tended to disagree. I tend to be rather a statist, but the more I've seen of civil servants and of governments, put me on the other side, on your side, really much more. And I've come to think that best government is on the whole least government, and most things run by government are run very badly. So I'm grateful to you for inviting me.
Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for that as well. Obviously, I'm delighted to hear it, and hopefully nothing in the next 50 minutes or so will put you off that conversion. I tend to ask you primarily about 3 of the 6 politicians you profile in the book. Aneurin Bevan, Enoch Powell and Keith Joseph. That makes for a more manageable conversation. Hopefully it gives everyone here a greater incentive to buy the book and find out about the other 3 as well. And I do recommend the book. It's a great read. But I'll start actually with just some general questions before we get into the specific personalities. And I guess the first one is rather obvious, but where did the idea for this book come from, and what does it mean to make the weather as a politician?
There are 2 sources of the book. The first is Winston Churchill, who in his book Great Contemporaries said that Joseph Chamberlain, who was colonial secretary in the early 20th century, although he was never prime minister, never foreign secretary, never chancellor, he had more influence than those who were. He made the weather, he set the agenda. The second influence, a very different person, is Tony Benn. And Tony Benn once said to me he'd proposed a motion in Parliament that would at a stroke repeal every single enactment of Margaret Thatcher's various governments. And he said obviously it wouldn't get through, but he said even if it did, it wouldn't have much impact, because Margaret Thatcher's influence was less as a legislator than as a teacher. But he said obviously he opposed Margaret Thatcher's teaching, but he said the problem with the left, which I think is right, is that it hasn't had a teacher since Aneurin Bevan, who's the first of my exhibits, if you like. So those were the 2 influences on the book.
And you chose 6 politicians.
Yeah.
I suppose I could ask why those 6, but perhaps more interesting is, were there any that nearly made the cut but you decided not to include?
Yes, the one who nearly made the cut was Ian MacLeod, who decolonised very rapidly. I think without him, we might have got bogged down in Africa the way the French were in Algeria or the Portuguese in Angola and Mozambique. And a lot of people have asked me, they won't ask this, I suspect, in a politically incorrect place like the IEA, but a lot of people in more politically correct places say, why no women? And I should say I've excluded prime ministers from this list, obviously, or Margaret Thatcher would be in. But the nearest woman to get in would have been Barbara Castle if her trade union reforms in 1969 had got through, but they weren't. Now, a lot of people have also asked me about other politicians. They've mentioned, for example, R.A. Butler, Michael Heseltine, Kenneth Clarke, Neil Kinnock, Hugh Gaitskell, and so on. And the reason they're not in is simple. But what they did was to adapt their parties to the prevailing consensus. Now, my six all were contrarians. They were opposed to the consensus. Roy Jenkins least of all opposed to it, but he thought the consensus, if it was to survive, needed a new political settlement, which meant a new party realignment, and proportional representation. And the terrible irony of all this is that his views are now echoed by Nigel Farage, whose realignment would be not on the centre-left, but on the far right. It's understandable Nigel Farage takes this position because after all, 1 in 7 people voted for his party, but he only gained 5 seats. And worth pointing out, the last 2 national elections we had under proportional representation for the European Parliament in 2014 and 2019, parties led by Farage won both of them, and in 2019 the Conservatives secured just 9% of the vote, and that meant the end of Theresa May.
I mean, I wasn't going to ask much about Nigel Farage, but you say that along with Keith Joseph, he was probably the most consequential post-war politician. Do you think, I mean, is there more influence and consequence in his future, or has his hand been played now?
Well, you're asking about the future. Look, it's difficult enough for historians to find out what happened in the past. But look, Nigel Farage is remarkable because whether you're in favour of Brexit or not, I think you can't deny it's probably the most consequential foreign policy decision we've taken since 1945. And you could also argue that if he'd never existed, it might not have happened, that he turned it from a crank issue to the centre of the political agenda. He did that without being an MP and without belonging to any of the major parties. He's a much underestimated politician. But his Achilles heel, and I've spoken about this, I will say that I don't share his views. I was a Remainer. But nevertheless, very generously, he gave me a 20-minute telephone interview. And I put this point to him that I think he didn't answer. I said to him, unlike what we might call the radical right parties on the continent, he's not an interventionist. In economic policy, he believes in the market economy and Thatcherism and so on. And the leaders, what you might call the cheerleaders of Brexit, shared that view. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg, John Redwood, and so on. But what you might call the foot soldiers of Brexit, the followers, particularly in the northeast of England, they didn't want more globalisation. They wanted protection against globalisation. And therefore the sort of programme that he and John Redwood and Rees-Mogg, and no doubt the IEA would favour, would be strongly opposed by those sort of people. Now, the sort of policy, people talk a lot about Singapore-on-Thames, and that's a bad analogy because Singapore's an authoritarian state. The real analogy, I think, is with what Australia and New Zealand did when we joined the European community, as the EU then was in 1973. They did liberalise their economies. They did follow what you might call Thatcherite economic policies. They were very, very painful in the short run. I think a number of farmers committed suicide when their subsidies went. But in the long run, it's proved, on the whole, successful. Now, I take the view that there was no electoral appetite for that sort of policy in Britain, if you like, a fifth term of Margaret Thatcher, and that COVID, which has encouraged a move of intervention, has made it even less likely. So I think Farage is involved in a contradiction. Frankly, he didn't, I think, really give me a solution to that problem that he faces.
All right. Well, I don't know that Farage to Bevan is a natural transition, but we'll try and do it anyway. So the first chapter in your book is about Nigel Bevan, founder of the National Health Service. Before we get to that, I mean, can you tell us a little bit about his background? He has sort of quite a remarkable life story by contemporary standards.
Yes, I met Harold Wilson just once, and he said to me he thought Nigel Bevan was the most self-educated person, the best self-educated person he never ever met. He left school at a very early age, went down the mines for a while, and then he educated himself to an extraordinary degree. And when he went with his rather hagiographic biographer Michael Foote to Stratford to a Shakespeare play. He joined in a discussion with the actors afterwards on different interpretations of Shakespeare. He wrote a short thesis on Immanuel Kant, which he sent to a fellow of Jesus College, Oxford, who said it was really one of the finest things he'd actually read about Kant. So he was remarkable, a remarkable product of a very difficult, poverty-stricken environment. And he was, in a way, very much a figure of his times.
And I think if I interpret what you write correctly here, it's not so much the creation of the NHS that makes him such an important figure. It was the precise way in which he created the NHS and the characteristics of it.
Right.
Tell us about that. How might it have been different if someone else had been Health Secretary?
There was a white paper on health produced by the Conservative Minister of the coalition government, Henry Willink, in 1944, which suggested a health service based on local government and retaining the voluntary hospitals. Now, the doctors were furious about that. Indeed, they're furious about any reform of the health service, would have been. Willink had to back down, and he was about to produce a watered-down scheme. I'm not clear what it would be when the Conservatives were defeated. And Bevan tore all that up, and he established a health service based on two principles, which remarkably remain today. It's the only part of the Attlee settlement, if you like, that still remains. The first was the hospital should be nationalised. We shouldn't have local hospitals or voluntary hospitals. They should be nationalised. The second was to be financed almost entirely out of taxation. And Bevan was, I think, the prime representative of democratic socialism in Britain since the war. He said the redistributive aspects of the health service were almost as important for him as the health aspects. And he said millionaires should be delighted that their money is going to heal the sick. It's fair to say that was at a time when the person on average wages would be paying either very little income tax or none at all. Of course, it's very different now. But these were the basic principles. And he said if you have a public health service, he says it will be accountable to the public through Parliament. He had a rather, I think, some ways naive belief in the House of Commons. And he said when a maid drops a bucket of slops in a hospital, this will echo throughout Whitehall. And he said the health service will put a megaphone in the mouth of every complainant. And he also said that because of Parliament, there would have very soon be a socialist Britain, because the working class were a majority, and the Attlee government would be the first instalment, and so we would proceed on the way to socialism, and the health service was an instrument of socialism. It's fair to say that, as I mentioned in my book, Aneurin Bevan did not himself use a National Health Service doctor. When he was asked who his doctor was, he said it's Sir Daniel Davis, who was the King George VI's personal physician. And although he favoured the idea of as many people as possible from all social groups living in municipal housing, in council houses, he himself lived in Belgravia and owned a large farm in Buckinghamshire. So you can draw what conclusions you like from that.
Yes, I mean, I think you jumped ahead of me there, because I was going to say your conclusions on Bevan are not particularly favourable. I mean, in particular, you mentioned the sort of the hypocrisy there.
Yeah.
Also, I suppose just that the way he went about creating the health service prevented us from going in the direction that many European countries went, and which has actually proved much more effective over the long run.
Yes, it might have been right in the 1940s. At that time, it was a period of rationing queues, and people were grateful for what they could get. Doctors couldn't do that much before antibiotics were invented. And older people remember the bedside manner of doctors. It's a substitute for treatment. And they would say to you, if you go to bed and take an aspirin, you'll get better in a few days. And people were very pleased. They thought, what a wonderful doctor. But actually, we're getting better naturally anyway. And doctors really didn't have much power to cure. And we live in a totally different world now. And one of the reasons we live in a different world is that health has improved so much. And it's an odd comment that Wes Streeting made, that the way to cut spending on national health is to improve the preventative services, because the healthier people are, the more they'll cost the health service in living on into old age, which is when so much of the expenditure occurs. I mean, if you want to save money on the health service, tell everyone to smoke 100 cigarettes a day, and then you'll soon cut down expenditure, because people won't live so long. But you're right. I mean, Bevan was a good man, but Isaiah Berlin once said to me, the task in life of the wise is to undo the damage done by the good. And I think that's what we need to do in the case of Bevan's health service. It needs a proper scrutiny. You don't need Lord Darcy to tell you the system is crumbling. I mean, anyone can see that who uses health services. What we should have had from Lord Darcy was a proper comparative analysis of the health service here with health services, exclude America, which is irrelevant from this point of view, on the continent, perhaps Australia and elsewhere, and see whether we have anything to learn from them. I'm sure we have. Perhaps the IEA would sponsor such a comparative study. That's what we need so badly, not another analysis telling us the health service is in a mess. We all know that.
Well, quite right. No, indeed, that is something that we're working on.
Oh, good.
Yes. What about Bevan's just broader impact? I mean, I think I was struck in the book when you talk about the eventual abolition of Clause 4 of the Labour Party constitution, that it was sort of the end of Labour being a socialist party, if indeed they ever had been. I mean, it seems from your book that really Bevan did not succeed at all in winning over the Labour Party to his form of democratic socialism.
Well, his view was based on the community solidarity of the South Wales valleys, and that broke down in the 1950s with the growth of affluence and individualism, and people, instead of being pleased about their solidarity with the working classes, wanted to escape from it. More people owned their own houses, owned consumer goods, cars, refrigerators and the like, which their parents could only dream of. And instead of the working classes undermining capitalism, capitalism was undermining the working class. And Nigel Bevan disapproved of affluence. He said the affluent society was a vulgar society for the reason that we weren't putting enough aside for investment. But of course, the beneficiaries of the affluent society did not think it was vulgar. They were delighted that they had these goods. And when Nigel Bevan died, rather prematurely in 1960, one journalist wrote that in the South Wales coalfields from which he came, Marx and Engels have been supplanted by Marx and Spencer. And that the noise of class war, the sound of class war, has been dimmed by the hum of the spin dryer. And he said there will be no more Aneurin Bevans, which I think is true. He was a figure of his time. And the problem we're in is that the principles he laid down in the 1940s, which may have been right then, in a very different sort of world, are not appropriate for today. If you bought a car or radio set in the 1940s, you wouldn't think it would be working very well now. Why do principles set up in a very different sort of society, why are they appropriate for today? They're clearly not.
Well, let's move on to Enoch Powell, who I think is probably by some distance the most controversial figure in the book. I mean, indeed, I did wonder, should we talk about Enoch Powell at all? You feel a little bit nervous discussing him in a public forum, almost. I mean, do you share that reticence at all?
Enoch Powell's best remembered for what is inaccurately called the Rivers of Blood speech about immigration in 1968. Now, the actual words which he used, which were quoted from Virgil's Aeneid, were, as the Romans said, I foresee the Tiber flowing with blood. Now, very oddly for a classical scholar, he got that wrong, because it wasn't the Roman who said it, it was a Sibyl of Cumae who was Greek. And Aeneas himself was not a Roman, he was a Trojan who'd moved into Rome after the fall of Troy and intermarried with someone from Rome, so it didn't quite make his point. But he was talking about a genuine problem, and I think the racist overtones or undertones or whatever you say made it more difficult to confront the problem, because people were worried that if you discuss immigration, you'll be accused of racism. But I think today no one would doubt that it is a problem, because immigration then was averaging 50,000 per year. when we were in the EU, it averaged around 300,000 a year. And as you know, one of the arguments for leaving the EU was to control immigration or lessen immigration. It's now nearly 700,000 a year, over twice as much as it was when we were in the EU. Now, all this, I think, made it more difficult for Powell to get his views about the market economy across. And people often asked him, well, look, if you believe in the market economy, he said, how can you be against people crossing borders of their free choice? And he said he combined high Toryism with the market economy. And if the market economy clashed with the nation state was more important. And for that reason, you may think rather surprisingly, he did not favour a market solution to the health service. He favoured the National Health Service set up by Bevan because it was part of a contract by which the country made with its inhabitants to provide free health service. So he wasn't 100% the free marketeer that he's often seen. But I think his message was lost. One of my reviewers said, well, you haven't indicated the influence of Powell on Keith Joseph, but I don't think he did have that much influence for the reason I've given. And I think that it had to be rediscovered again by Joseph.
And I suppose one of the things about that so-called Rivers of Blood speech, first of all, although I think there's some degree of revisionism about it today on the edgier parts of the political right, it is quite an appalling speech in its tone and its appeal to people's baser instincts. Actually, the kind of policies he was discussing were not out of tune with the sentiments of the time or even that much with the Conservative Party, but it was the inflammatory approach he took. And it seems quite deliberately he took that approach and cynically. And I sort of wonder why, because as you said, it actually made it impossible or very difficult to talk about immigration for years or decades afterwards. It made him a political outcast. It probably set back many of the other things he believed in very strongly about the European community and the free market and everything else. But what drove him to deliver that speech? Do you think it was ego?
Well, first let me say it was out of line substantively with Tory policy because Powell's basic belief was that integration was not possible. He was much influenced by America, race riots, and by experience of India with communalism. And for that reason, he put much greater stress on repatriation of immigrants than the Conservative Party, and it was said that he favoured compulsory repatriation, or at least incentives to persuade people to leave, which wasn't Conservative Party policy. Conservative Party did believe in strict control of immigration, it's true. On the motives, Powell was... one of the reasons Powell was not more successful in conventional terms was he couldn't work with other people. He resigned from the Harold Macmillan government with Peter Thornycroft in 1958. He refused to take office under Alec Douglas Hume in 1963 because he was the supporter of R.A. Butler, but most other supporters of R.A. Butler did take office in the Hume government. And he was clearly opposed to many of Heath's policies in opposition. For example, he opposed the retention of British forces east of Suez, and he was against Heath's support of America in the Vietnam War. You may say he was right on both of those ideas, but I think he thought he could provoke Heath and be the power behind the throne. And it's fair to say, although it ruined his political career in conventional terms, he is arguably responsible, so sophologists believe, for putting Heath in 1970 and putting him out in February 1974 because of his opposition to the European community. But he was a contrarian. All my six are really contrarian.
And I think this chapter about Enoch Powell, I think, is particularly fascinating in the book because there are so many points that it makes you think of the present. There are so many echoes of today. And, in a sense, he was ahead of his time on so many of these issues. He anticipated perhaps shift. He was a proto-monetarist. He was perhaps the first Eurosceptic or Brexiteer before, of course, that was a term. He was the first to break from the consensus on immigration. Actually, at the moment we talk a lot about realignment in politics and a shift from alignment around economic issues towards elites versus the people or whatever. He was in some sense the first populist or first
yes, he was.
man from the right to attract mass working class support. And so we've seen all of those things happen. Let's jump back to the beginning in a way with Enoch Powell. Quite an extraordinary man. I think I knew before I read your chapter that he had been the first full professor in the Commonwealth, an amazing classical scholar. I hadn't realised he was the only soldier in World War II to make it all the way from private to brigadier. We don't really have people like this in politics or in life at all anymore, do we?
No, I mean, it's very difficult to think of any successors to most of the people I've written about in the book, who came from very varied backgrounds. People in politics now, they're a bit vanilla. They come from fairly similar backgrounds, usually the universities, research departments, SPADs, and then become an MP. Yes, you're right. It's a great loss. The experience isn't there. Perhaps it's particularly true of this government. Maybe unfair. I mean, a lot of people have commented there's no one there who's got any knowledge or experience of business or the financial world. Their careers are fairly similar.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose I'll ask you to talk about the future, or at least the present again, if I may. How relevant is Powell's view of nationhood, which is, you draw that out as the common theme that ties his views together. How relevant is that to the political debates today, perhaps particularly the one going on in the Conservative Party about their future direction?
Well, is France any less French because it's in the European Union? I would ask that. I think the questions about the European Union are basic questions, and the concrete question that really settled the Brexit issue, in my opinion, was immigration, and that related to the feelings of the left behind that the political system was not working for them, and that's what Farage has built on. The last election showed that even more strikingly. I mean, if you want a clear figure that shows this, if you add up the Labour and Conservative votes in the last election, they amount to 16.5 million. But 17.4 million voted to leave the European Union in 2016. And there are clearly a lot of people who feel, except for the referendum, the political system is not working for them. So but the danger of the Conservative Party, I think, is that they think the only loss of votes they had was to reform. It wasn't. They lost votes both to reform but also to Liberal Democrats. And the further they shift to reform, the more they will continue to lose votes to Liberal Democrats in places like Oxfordshire and Surrey. I mean, Oxfordshire, for the first time in its history, has no single Conservative MP. And that's not because of reform, it's because of Liberal Democrats. So it's very difficult for the Conservatives. And I'm not involved with either of the candidates, but I do think Kemi Badenoch is wise to say that a period of rethinking is needed, as it was from 1974 and also after 1945. People at the moment don't want to hear anything from the Conservative Party. They're discredited. What the sensible thing to do is, and IEA will play some part in this, I'm sure, set up study groups, think about how Conservative principles are best realised, and come out with these conclusions in about 2 years' time. This is roughly what happened after 1974 and to some extent after 1945. The great danger, I think David Frum, the American analyst, put it well. He said, if a party offers the voters ham and eggs, they reject it. The temptation is at the next election to offer them double ham and eggs. And that's, for example, what the Labour Party did after Miliband was defeated. And the Conservatives have sometimes done that. It doesn't on the whole work.
And I think we can move to 1974 now. And Keith Joseph. I mean, you already mentioned this in your first response.
Yeah.
But again, there are real echoes of the past. 50 years on, 1974 to 2004.
Yep.
The Conservative Party, after an election defeat, one faction led by the then leader Ted Heath, really thinking there was nothing fundamental wrong. That the key was to track to the centre, to win back Liberals, and keep going till the next election and hope for a different result. Now, Keith Joseph emerged, perhaps quite unexpectedly at that point, as someone with an entirely different view of where conservatism should go, a kind of a new consensus based on very different ideas, very radical ideas that broke with the post-war consensus. So, I mean, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that point in 1974 when Keith Joseph made a series of famous speeches which really lay out the agenda we now call Thatcherism.
I mean, Keith Joseph is a very good example of something that Nigel Farage said to me about his own career, which I think applies to all these six and any successful politician probably. He said the key to his success, Nigel Farage said, was persistence. And I think this is true of Keith Joseph, because I think no politician has ever been as much mocked as him, and these speeches you're talking about led to much mockery. I mean, Dennis Healey, who was Labour Chancellor in the 1970s, said he was a mixture of Hamlet, Rasputin and Tommy Cooper. And most politicians are mocked by the opposition, but he was mocked by his own party. I mean, Lord Hailsham said he was dotty, and Reginald Maudling said he was nutty as a fruitcake. But he achieved more than any of them, and he ignored. He was a rather very sensitive man, arguably too sensitive for politics. But he ignored all these things, and he said that, broadly speaking, that the Conservatives had gone too far along the road to statism. And he set down principles which I think are still broadly accepted. First, that the central economic policy of a government should be to ensure sound money to conquer inflation. And we've been too much misled by the pictures of these men in mufflers in the 1930s queuing at the employment exchange, that the problem now was not unemployment but inflation. Secondly, that we spend too much money on subsidising nationalised and private industries, thereby taking money away from the profitable areas. And thirdly, that the trade unions had far too many privileges and immunities. And he said that the entrepreneur had the Aladdin's lamp who could produce the wealth that would enable us to have better public services. And finally, his social message was that the problems of deprivation were not by any means solely economic but cultural, with problem families reproducing themselves, what he called the cycle of deprivation. And I think it's fair to say these are all the problems we are worried about now. But although he was successful in influencing thought, he wasn't, it's fair to say, a very successful minister. And unlike most politicians who boast about their non-existent achievements, he was the opposite. And when he finally left government in 1987, a journalist from one of the teachers' unions asked him, "Are you proud of what you've achieved in the Department of Education and Science?" And he replied, "No." But what he had actually done, which is often forgotten, he was the first to draw attention to the problem of non-academic children whom the education system did little for. And he didn't, I think, pose solutions to it, but Kenneth Baker later did with his university technical colleges. And although it's often forgotten, so did Theresa May and Boris Johnson. Theresa May with her T-levels, and Boris Johnson, I think it's called the lifetime loan guarantee, which comes into effect next year, which means that you'll get just as much of a grant to study car maintenance at a further education college as history at university. And this really, the problem that Joseph drew attention to is our central problem of skills, of non-academic children. And we do very well. Our elite universities are amongst the best in the world, but for over 100 years or more, since Joseph Chamberlain drew attention as well, we have not had good policies for people whose skills are technical and vocational. And Joseph was the first to draw attention to that. He very characteristically deprecated his achievements. He said that if he'd become leader of his party, it would have been a disaster for my country, my party and myself. And he said that his role had been that of what he called a convenient madman, a useful joke. But actually his influence, I think, is as great as that of Farage, and not only on the Conservative Party, but on New Labour. When the Labour government put forward its claim to host the World Cup, it said we are a nation of entrepreneurs, so it wouldn't have said before. And Peter Mandelson famously said he didn't mind people being what he called filthy rich, as long as they paid their taxes. Whether Keir Starmer will follow that, I suspect he won't. I suspect he's not, because the Labour Party have never forgiven Tony Blair for winning 3 elections. And Starmer's won an election on the third of the vote. I think he's not New Labour.
Yeah. I mean, Keith Joseph said, I think I don't know if it was the time or subsequently, that it wasn't until April 1974
Yes.
that he became a Conservative. Yep. He'd already been a Conservative MP for the best part of 2 decades at that point. What brought about the conversion? You said Enoch Powell didn't actually influence him that much. What happened?
That's a good question. I find it difficult to answer. It may be bodies like the IEA. I think he did used to come to seminars here, and he thought we ought to learn more about the free market, particularly how it was working in Germany under Social Democrat governments. So I think it was that to some extent. What he gave the Conservatives was something I hadn't had before in the post-war period, not perhaps since Joseph Chamberlain. He gave them intellectual self-confidence. They'd been on the defensive against Labour. He performed the same function for the Conservatives as people like Tawney, Cole and Laskin performed for the Labour Party in the 30s. They paved the way for the Labour victory of 45. And I think whenever you have these, or often when you have these large victories, there's someone with an idea behind him. Keith Joseph once said that. He quoted the Chinese, said, power comes from the firing of a gun or something like that. He said, but behind the gun there's always someone with an idea. And to put the point in an extreme and perhaps rather unpleasant form, a group of French aristocrats, Carlyle says, were laughing over the first edition of Rousseau's Social Contract. He says the second edition was bound with their skins. And so I think he did that. It's a very powerful effect.
In the conclusion to the book, I think drawing on Henry Kissinger, you say that leaders who make the weather are particularly needed when old certainties dissolve. Do you feel old certainties are dissolving now? And could you have predicted that any of these people would make the weather had you been there at the beginning?
But they were all disruptive figures, and they're the ones who make the weather. The book has an epigraph from Bernard Shaw, who said, the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man tries to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress comes from unreasonable men. I think that's true. And all these people, they also had another quality, which is very rare in politics today. They're all great communicators. Now, the first job of an academic is to teach and write books. The first task of a politician is to communicate. Now, whatever you think of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, I don't think their best friends would say they were brilliant communicators. Nigel Farage is a brilliant communicator. But it's not enough just to be a communicator. You also have to have something to communicate. And Margaret Thatcher said about President Clinton that he's the great communicator, but he has nothing to communicate. And I think all these people had something to communicate. They were very, very good communicators. I can't think of anyone in British politics today other than Farage who is really a great communicator. In some ways, Jeremy Corbyn was to a certain audience, it's fair to say. It's worth pointing out that Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party got more votes in 2019 and 17 than Keir Starmer in 2024, and also got a higher share of the vote than Keir Starmer in 2017, and would have got a higher share of the vote in 2019, which people say is Labour's worst defeat ever. 2000 would have got a higher share of the vote if it wasn't for Scotland. If the SNP hadn't imploded, Corbyn would have got a better percentage of the vote than Starmer. So he did appeal. He had the effect of some perhaps extreme politics. He appealed enormously to a core vote while alienating many people, and if you like, the floating voters. And of course some of his vote now, well, has gone to these independents, and the 5 independents in Parliament, the largest number of independents since the abolition of the university seats in 1950. And as on the continent, the real victors of the election are the far right and the far left, much more than the Social Democrats of Starmer's variety.
I always like to end on an optimistic note, but I think actually this is not going to be an optimistic note to end on, I'm afraid. Maybe the audience can provide some optimism. But right at the end, it may even be the last paragraph, you say it may be that the historical era inaugurated by Margaret Thatcher is coming to an end. The sort of delayed impact of the financial crisis and then the COVID-19 pandemic, a rise in, I suppose, people's desire for state intervention. How sure are you of that conclusion? And do you have a sense of what comes next if the era of Margaret Thatcher is done?
I may have exaggerated it. I mean, there's some things that of Thatcherism that will, I think, certainly remain. And people sometimes say that Thatcherism was divisive, and in some respects I think it was. But like the Attlee government, it was also uniting in the sense that it closed off certain questions that had been controversial. If you take one example, in the late 1980s, I think the top tax rate was 60%. It's now 45%. Now, is there anyone who thinks it'll go back to 60%? Until Margaret Thatcher, the trade unions were almost completely untouched by the law. Now, whatever Starmer does, is anyone who really think that's going to happen again? I don't think it will. So there are some aspects which it will survive. I don't think anyone thinks we're going to have large-scale nationalisation, whatever happens to the railways. I think the problem that wasn't resolved by Keith Joseph or Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair for that matter is this, that Margaret Thatcher's aim, the economics wasn't, as she admitted herself, an end in itself. It was a means to the end of creating a better society. Now, she often spoke about Victorian values and individual responsibility. And what she really had in mind was a rather idealised picture, I think, of the 1950s. But anyway, she didn't create that better society. And one Tory journalist, it was Peregrine Wolfson, put the point rather unkindly. He said that what Margaret Thatcher wanted was an economy in the image of her father, a prudent corner shopkeeper in Grantham, but the kind of economy she created was an economy in the image of her son, who was a rather dubious entrepreneur who drew the attention of the tax authorities to his activities. And she was very hostile to borrowing money. She was proud of the fact that you don't borrow money. It wasn't boom and bust. You're prudent and you save and so on. A kind of Methodist background, no doubt. But the image we have after the Big Bang is young men drinking immoderately in Liverpool Street Station before going home on Friday evenings to Essex. That wasn't the sort of economy she wanted to create. And the individualism that it led to also had other unfortunate social consequences. Keith Joseph was surprised that when people had secure, he ran a housing trust, and when people had secure housing, the divorce rate increased. Now, when people were better off, they were more able to appraise unsatisfactory relationships. And I think both Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher knew that capitalism, to work effectively, needs a powerful social framework, particularly based on trust and integrity and so on. I think it's fair to say they didn't know how to create it, and nor did Tony Blair. And that's the problem I think Thatcherism leaves open for new generations to resolve.
But
yes,
so
you're right.
No human stock, no Margaret Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher wouldn't have stood if Joseph had stood, and you're right, that speech stopped him. So anyway, Joseph had the unfortunate characteristic of a politician of always apologising for things he'd done before. He apologised for this speech as well, but he apologised for his policies under the Macmillan government, the high-rise flats and the reorganisation of London government. He apologised for the 1970s reorganisation of the health service under the Heath government. And indeed, when he met a housing minister in the early 80s in Margaret Thatcher's government, he said, "You'll find a lot of problems in the housing department. I've created most of them." And he once, the journalist Simon Hoggart noticed that once he made a speech shortly after the Jewish Day of Atonement. He was an observant Jew, and he said it was a sign of his growing self-confidence that he was apologising for a speech before actually making it. So you clearly couldn't have someone who was apologising. Now, on the substantive point, yes, he misunderstood some research that was done, as discussed in my book. And what was actually happening was that as knowledge of birth control spread, women from all social classes were limiting their families. And the irony of it was that as Health Secretary, Keith Joseph had opposed contraceptive devices being free on the National Health Service, which Barbara Castle under the succeeding Labour government had introduced. So the speech was a whole muddle in a sense. But he did have a basic point which was obscured, that there was a problem of deprivation which was cultural and not economic. As you said, there was widespread misunderstanding of the speech. I mean, one correspondent wrote to him and said, "You're absolutely right, the Irish should stop breeding." And one of the people who supported the speech was Laurence Olivier, who wrote saying, "Congratulations." He was called in the press a saloon bar Malthus, and I think one union leader did say what you said, that his policy was to stop working class people having children. But, as a politician, you've got to be aware of misunderstanding. I think Enoch Powell once said, "A politician who complains about the media is like a sailor complaining about the sea."
Adrian.
He said in 1939, despite the Nazi-Soviet pact when the war broke out, "We will win with the aid of Russia." And his argument was that both Britain and Russia were the two, as it were, part European powers. Britain because of an island, being an island off the continent, and Russia being only part European, and therefore had a lot in common which they didn't share with the other countries on the continent. But if I had to ask you which politician of the 1960s was hostile to NATO, which was hostile to the Americans in Vietnam, which was hostile to Britain's presence east of Suez, who favoured homosexual law reform, who favoured abortion law reform, who was strongly in favour of the National Health Service, how many in the audience would say, "Oh, that's Enoch Powell"? Well, you'd say it was someone like Michael Foot, but it actually was Enoch Powell. And that partly explains why he was so uncongenial a figure in the Conservative Party. He wasn't part of what you might call the orthodox right. And he wasn't, once India was independent, he became strongly in favour of decolonisation. He hoped India could be kept. Once it wasn't, he said we must abandon our whole imperial mindset.
Okay, another question, please. Oh, the gentleman right at the back.
I'm just wondering if you have someone who came 7th or 8th who might have been your favourite but was left out.
Well, Enoch Powell, yes. I mean, he's not a favourite in a way, but I mean, the influence on decolonisation, I think, is important. He'd be number 7. No one else I can think of in the post-war period.
Yes, gentleman on the aisle.
Thank you. In your passing remark about Brexit, you prayed in the much-used observation that was about the left behind.
Mm.
There was so much talk about that I thought for a while I was a 70-year-old lady from Bolton with questionable social attitudes. But you will acknowledge that there was a significant intellectual cohort leading Brexit, or very influential. Didn't Powell give them a vision of the importance of national sovereignty? And given that public international law was formed by the emergence of an idea of national sovereignty, and given that there is widespread popular alienation from politics, or politicians are now in a community with NGOs and government and not with the people, will there not be a backlash against international organisations as a legacy of Powell? And may we not end up going back to sovereignty and intergovernmental cooperation as opposed to supranational cooperation?
Yes, you're right about the intellectual case. What I would say was it didn't actually have legs, if you see what I mean, until immigration became a key issue. For example, in 2001, William Hague said you've got 24 hours to save the pound. I don't think most people knew what he was talking about. And there was no doubt scepticism towards Europe. It wasn't a priority for most people. Had it been, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition would never have been formed in 2010. It was one of those periods when Europe didn't seem to be an issue. What made it an issue was mass immigration, particularly after the expansion of the EU to Central and Eastern Europe. And I think if Cameron had been able to get concessions on that, the vote would have gone the other way. He was very unfortunate because the Baltic states and Poland said that we agree with you, we're losing our best and brightest, but we can't say that because the communists stopped emigration and free movement, and we can't appear to align ourselves with the communist. So it was that issue. I think Margaret Thatcher, if she'd been there, would have banged the table with Angela Merkel and said, look, if you don't give me any concessions on immigration, I will campaign for a leave vote. And I think that would have altered her view. And it's interesting, I was told by people in the EU that the French and Germans regarded the vote, as perhaps you might expect, as a provisional vote, and assumed that Cameron would then come back to negotiate further, which they would have made concessions. But when he decided to resign, and people say he resigned immediately, he didn't, but there was no contest for the Conservative leadership. Theresa May didn't, in the end, have any opponents. And when Theresa May said, well, Brexit is Brexit, they said, well, we can't waste any political capital on this issue any further. So it was quite a close thing, but obviously the verdict was for Brexit.
I mean, one of the things I found quite interesting in the book, actually, the part about Enoch Powell, was that he started off seemingly as quite an enthusiastic and sincere supporter of Britain joining the European community. And in a way, it feels like he went on the journey, as they say now, that the whole Tory party went on decades later and much more slowly. He accomplished it in the space of a few years.
Yeah. Yes, that's a fair point. I mean, what made the Tories Eurosceptic, if you like, was the catastrophe, if you like, of the ERM. I mean, I think that after that it delegitimised pro-Europeanism in the Tory party.
Interesting. Ace on that.
John Major used to say that Munster Union was right in principle, but it was too early. Europe wasn't ready for it. I think that's probably right.
After 18 years of Thatcher and Major, the Conservative Party didn't seem to go through a renewal or even attempt to do that, as they did in the mid-70s. Why did they fail, do you think, to even start?
Cameron did a bit.
No, so in 97. So Cameron wasn't there till
No,
95.
well, I think, as I said, it's David Fromm's point. You offer them twice ham and eggs, which they did in 2001-5. Though I think probably in 2001, at any rate, no one could have defeated Blair. I think in 2005 he was vulnerable because of the Iraq War, but the Tories couldn't take that position. The Liberal Democrats did.
Or was it because the wrong leader got elected by mistake?
I suspect no other leader could have defeated Blair with the economy. He inherited a good economy and didn't muck it up. And I think no other leader could have defeated Blair, really. He was, in my opinion, a politician of great genius with, I mean, what the Germans call Fingerspitzengefühl, antennae for... He's still got that. I think his website is very, very good and impressive. And he realised what Labour had to do, great instincts, New Labour. But it's been disowned, as far as I can see, by the Labour Party, which I think is very foolish.
Do we have one more question? Oh, we can have two more questions then. So, chap at the back and then the man on the aisle here.
Thank you. So you asserted earlier about Enoch Powell's preference to put the nation state ahead of the market economy. Now, you also spoke about the so-called foot soldiers of Brexit being primarily economically on the left. Would you not agree that, much like Powell and Farage, the commonality there is that those foot soldiers of Brexit also have that preference for the nation state of the market economy, and that is fundamentally the reason for Brexit and that sort of coalition forming, as opposed to the disagreement on economic views?
Yes, I agree with that. But as I said a few moments ago, the national state aspect only became concrete with immigration, that we couldn't control it, that most people wanted it controlled, and it would have been unlawful for Parliament to restrict EU immigration. I think one area where the left behind, if we call them that, agree with Farage but not with Powell, they tend to be socially conservative with the small c, which Powell wasn't. Say he was in favour of abortion reform, law reform, homosexual law reform, against capital punishment, which some, at least, Lee Anderson of Reform UK, certainly in favour of capital punishment, which he says is 100% effective as a deterrent. And Farage is I think, a social conservative. So there's a difference there with Powell. He was a more complex and eccentric figure than appears, I think. He's seen solely through perhaps that prism of immigration and Europe. I got to know a bit. He was very helpful to me in a bit of research I did on paper I did on the Conservative leadership struggles, he knew I disagreed with him about the succession of Alec Douglas, Hume and Macmillan, but I must say I liked him. He was very hospitable, courteous and so on. I think most people who met him, whatever their political views, did not dislike him.
And yes, sir.
Which of these politicians would you call a libertarian?
Any libertarians in the book?
Yes, well, from one, Powell certainly, Joseph, Roy Jenkins in a way most of all. And Roy Jenkins said, he wrote a book called The Labour Case in 1959, designed to make the case for Labour to win the election, which of course it lost. But he added on a final chapter of issues which he said weren't usually on the agenda of politics, these issues of personal liberty, homosexual law reform, abortion law reform, and then not so much libertarian, perhaps race discrimination, sex discrimination. And he said these matters, he said, if put right, will have more effect on the lives of ordinary people than even the most perfect of economic policies. And I must say I agree. And one other area, it's difficult for anyone here to believe it existed, but he got theatre censorship abolished. And theatre censorship before the 60s was in the hands of a Lord Chamberlain, who was a court official. And he had complete discretion as to ban any play or lines in plays, and couldn't be questioned in Parliament because he was a court official. And he knew no more about the theatre, I suppose, than any moderately well-educated playwright. He got John Osborne's play The Entertainer in 1957. He demanded the exclusion of the line, "Those playing fields of Eton have really got us beaten." That was excluded. And then he, in I think the same year or about that time, Samuel Beckett's play Endgame was licensed for performance in French, but not in English on grounds of blasphemy. So either, it seems to me, the Lord Chamberlain did not understand French, or he thought anyone who did was already so corrupt as to be redemption. But that is the last question. I have stressed the importance of communication in politicians, and although I'm not a politician, I hope I've communicated enough to persuade you to buy the book, which I will sign.
Absolutely.
Which I will sign at no extra charge.
Well, Vernon, for everything, including that offer, thank you very much indeed.